Good morning. I'm Channa Wijesinghe, CEO of the Accounting Professional and Ethical Standards Board, the standard setter for professional and ethical standards in Australia. When setting Australian standards, APESB takes into account the global code issued by the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants, or IESBA. And today with me is Sylvie Soulier, who has had a long association with IESBA, which stretches back 15 years. Initially, Sylvie was the technical advisor for 9 years, then a board member for 6 years, and she recently stepped down as a board member in December 2019. But her association is continuing with IESBA special projects on the objectivity of the engagement quality control reviewer, as well as the independence of component auditors in the context of group audits. Sylvie's day job is she is the global independence partner of EY and the Asia Pacific leader for independence as well. Sylvie, welcome to Australia and more specifically to APESB's offices in Melbourne.
Okay, Channa, really, I would like to thank you for your very kind invitation. I am very thrilled to be here in Australia with you again. And really thank you for the opportunity to present our new proposals on auditors' independence and the kind support of yourself and the APESB.
Thanks, Sylvie. Yes, it's very pertinent, the IESBA EDs which have just come out last week, as currently there is a inquiry, parliamentary inquiry into audit regulation in Australia, and auditor independence and conflicts of interest are a key focus of that inquiry as well. And as you know, from 1st January 2020, the restructured code came into effect, and which is largely based on IESBA's restructured code as well. And in December 2019, the Auditing Standards Board in Australia issued a legislative instrument which provides legal backing for the restructured code. So in context of these proposals on non-assurance services and fees, I believe it's a response to issues raised by global stakeholders. Can you please elaborate, for example, to what extent these proposals may have been impacted by the inquiries into the audit profession in the UK and in Australia?
So actually, the regulatory stakeholders that are following very closely the work of IESBA have had very long-standing concerns about the threats to independence that are created by the provision of non-assurance services to audit clients. And it is something that the IESBA has been following very closely. And I would say that already since the 90s, the earlier version of the code, we were already addressing independence issues created by the provision of non-assurance services. It is true that more recently, we have seen some changes, acceleration also of a number of concerns from the regulatory authorities. And indeed, we follow very closely what's happening in UK, Australia, and other countries. But I don't think exactly we could say that the IESBA is influenced by what's happening in the UK and Australia for a number of reasons. IESBA is an international independent standard setting board. So our member composition is international from every jurisdiction. So we do have representatives from the UK, from Australia, but for many other jurisdictions as well. Our code is a global code with global application. And it wouldn't be fair to say that a global code would be only influenced by one or two jurisdictions. However, we are extremely aware of what's going on and interested. And we do follow very closely the development from the major countries. So also, we started those two projects before the inquiries in UK and Australia. And we also started to gather feedback earlier, including the roundtable you had us set in Australia 3 years ago. Was it 3 years ago?
It was about 2018 June.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's true. We really follow the development, and the discussion and the debate is also feeding our thought process and the way we want to respond. And we do expect, or we hope, that the proposal and certain provision in our new proposal will also be helpful to provide some element of response to the concerns that you are discussing in Australia.
Thanks, Sylvie. And to add to it, I think we should also point out that IESBA has been working on the restructure of the code for a long time, which probably dates back to about 2012 or 13. And now it's the process is towards the late tail end, because if all of these proposals go through by the end of 2021, we will have a very robust and strong code going forward. So a follow-up question is, why are the proposed revisions coming so soon after the code was revised and restructured?
Actually, it was intended that way.
Okay.
For us, when we started the restructuring and certain very significant revision, in particular the revision of the conceptual framework, for us it was really the first step, and we knew already that looking at non-assurance services and fees would be next. We thought it would be important to have a very robust restrictor code, and also looking again at the conceptual framework, making it much stronger. And that would really create a base, a very robust base for us to develop new pronouncements. So it's almost like phase one and phase two. And actually in our strategic work plan, it was already announced that way, that we are laying first a robust base, and then we will go into more precise, detailed pronouncements on particularly non-assurance services and fees.
Thank you. Just a comment on the conceptual framework is that sometimes in some countries people prefer prohibitions versus the principles-based approach in the code. And a way I sometimes explain to people in respect of the prohibitions is that when you apply the conceptual framework to that instance, it effectively means that there is no safeguard to address a threat, and that's why it results in a prohibition. And in those instances, that the code is pretty much saying that you can't do it, rather than having a prescriptive list, which sometimes over time people might be able to find loopholes and come up with a name for a service that doesn't really, you can't really have it fit in that hole, and they sort of try to get away with it, while a principles-based framework is much better.
I couldn't say it better. I think you really captured the essence of the code. That's exactly our point. By having a principle-based conceptual framework, it means that the rationale for everything that is in the code is clear and consistent. And the reason why we could conclude on a prohibition is absolutely clear, because the users really understand not only that there is a prohibition, but why there is a prohibition and what are the facts, circumstances, and conditions of that prohibition or any other type of requirement. So you're absolutely right on the spot.
Thanks. Then in respect of the EDs on non-assurance services and fees, what are the key features of the proposed exposure drafts. And if you can highlight to our listeners the most significant revisions that are being proposed.
First, I think it's important to highlight that we are issuing two exposure drafts at the same time, one on non-assurance services and another one on fees, because they are very closely linked one to another. I mean, they have their unique features, but there are some elements of um, coordination, I would say, or commonalities that are helpful. And it is making sense for readers and commenters to see the whole package, I would say. So that's the reason why we are issuing the two together. But each of them really have key features and major proposal for changes. For instance, for non-assurance services, one of the very significant changes is how we look at self-review threats in the context of audits. I would say that in the past, until now, the sentiment was that it was okay to have a certain level of self-review threat in certain circumstances. And even if the current code has a pretty strict prohibition for certain types of non-assurance services for public interest entities or PIEs, there were a number of exceptions, and usually those exceptions were depending on materiality criteria. And going back to what we were saying earlier, we can see that the acceptability of that, I would say, flexibility over the evaluation of the self-review threat from stakeholders, from regulators, is really different today. I would say that what was acceptable 10 years ago is really not acceptable in the public interest today. And one of the key changes is really the elimination of those exceptions. Plus, a consequence also is when you introduce a full prohibition on something like self-review threat, because it has consequence, you have to be very clear of what you mean by self-review threat. So we are providing revised definition, application material, examples to really help the users and the stakeholder to identify the situation where there is self-review, because those situations will be prohibited for public interest entities. So that's a very significant change. If I am looking at fees, one of the key changes, it's a really new introduction of a number of elements in the code, is we want to address the relationship between the level of audit fees and auditor independence. And we are really looking at the level of audit fees to make sure that it really promotes audit quality, and look at various facts and circumstances and situation, and also, highlight, I would say, the danger zone issues in relation to setting audit fees. Of course, we pay a lot of attention not to step in some issues such as competition issues, but clearly in relation to ethics and independence, there is a lot that can be added about the level of audit fees. And then, as I mentioned, the fact that it is jointly issued, there are a number of proposals that apply to both to non-assurance services and fees, which is significant reinforcement in the communication with those charged with governance. And that's one of the key proposals. And for fees, we even go further by introducing some requirements on transparency and some requirements on public disclosure of fees in the code as well.
Very good. So it seems that the requirements for public interest entities or PIEs are going to get even more stricter
Yeah.
going forward. So, what is a PI from the global context?
Um, we do have a definition of public interest entities, which is a twofold definition. In the code, listed entities are always considered public interest entities, but the code also open for the possibility for jurisdiction to add some other types of categories of entities as public interest entities to respond to what are the public interest concerns in a specific jurisdiction. So you have the listed ones that are always in, and then you have a number of other type of entities, and that will depend on every jurisdiction. I know, and we had that discussion earlier, that in Australia, you wanted in your own code actually to clarify those types of entities that are considered public interest entities in Australia.
Yes, that's correct. So we did add in an additional OS paragraph which spoke about banks, finance companies, insurance companies, and then private health insurance who are regulated by the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority as public interest entities. And also we have a general category if there is any funding required from the public, whether you issue a debt or equity instrument. So the Australian code has additional entities which will be captured by the public interest entity definition, and which means in turn they will be subject to the more stricter auditor independence requirements. So why does IESBA believe that the audit independence requirements for PIs should be more stringent than non-PIs?
I think the rationale is clear. You know, we're talking about public interest here. And we believe that because those entities have a very large number of stakeholders, very high expectation, and whatever happens with those entities may have a significant public impact. We consider that in the application of our conceptual framework, the acceptability of the level of the threat to independence is not at the same level, whether you are talking about a public interest entities versus a non-public interest entities. So because the threshold, in a sense, is higher for public interest entities, you may reach the level of prohibition much quicker. And that's really our rationale, the related a lot also to perception and appearance issues. I wanted to go back also on the point you mentioned that the Australia, you felt the need to go a bit deeper with more granularity in the definition of public interest entities. And actually, IESBA is intense to do the same, put back on the table our current definition of public interest entities to see whether we can provide more consistency and application material to help jurisdiction developing exactly what you have done in Australia. Because to be honest, our current definition of public interest entity was developed 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So perhaps, it's a good
It's
time
time to look at it again.
to look at it again.
Yeah.
Economic development, criteria, the world is changing. So it could be helpful to look at that. And also expectation about financial institutions, as
Yes.
you mentioned, also something perhaps to add in the code. And so we have also that project.
Yeah, I saw
getting
that
started.
that's getting started as well. It appears that the proposed prohibition on the self-review threat and the removal of the materiality qualifier will significantly reduce the non-audit services provided to audit clients, actually for PI audit clients. Why does IESBA believe that these changes are necessary?
Actually, it goes back to what I was explaining about the acceptability of a certain level of self-review. What was considered acceptable, I would say, 15 years ago, that you could be the auditor but still have some level of self-review. We can see it in the world. It's no longer acceptable in many jurisdictions. Since then, a number of jurisdictions have already moved to some full prohibition on certain types of services where the self-review rate is absolutely obvious, like bookkeeping, internal audit activities, certain valuation, etc. And so first, that's the fact that we would be eliminating some of the exceptions is making a lot of sense. I don't think that the elimination of those exceptions will have a significant impact necessarily on the audit practice. The other element might also impact also the profession, but in a different way. It is the fact that, as I explained, if you introduce a prohibition on a very important principle, not having a self-review threat, you have to be very precise how you define it and how you detect it, how you evaluate it. And that's our intent. And we intend to really provide a lot of content, guidance to help auditors to determine the situations where there is a self-review so they can eliminate those situations and avoid it. So detecting the potential of self-review threat in some other services than the usual ones I mentioned, bookkeeping, valuation, etc., is an important addition of the code. It could lead, indeed, to additional prohibitions, yes, for PIEs.
Yeah. And I'm also pleased to see that that both sets of proposals or exposure drafts have enhanced communication with those charged with governance. Can you explain whether there are any differences in these requirements to communicate with those charged with governance with the requirements of the auditing standards to communicate with those charged with governance?
The current requirement on communication with those charged with governance in relation to independence and ethics, which is really the scope of the code, are pretty aligned with the code as it is today. So in a nutshell, it is about having a dialogue with those charged with governance before the issuance of the audit report on everything that relates to independence. And also there are some requirement in the case of breaches to independence, to have some immediate communication. What we will be doing is to provide much more content and situation to triggers communication that we believe are very relevant and significant with those charged with governance. So it's about being more precise on the nature, the content, and the timing of those communication. For instance, in relation to non-assurance services, there will be an expectation to communicate with those charged with governance before the provision of a non-assurance service. So yes, it will create additional occasions or situations for those communications. Similarly, in relation to fees, there will be an enhanced focus on the discussion about the level of audit fees versus, in relation to audit quality. So yes, it is new, and we are working very closely with the IESBA. So we will have, the full alignment eventually between what is today in the auditing standard, aligned to today's code, and what will be tomorrow in their standard, and what will be in the code.
Very good. So in respect of fee disclosures, there are some proposals in the fee exposure draft. and these go beyond the current auditor reporting requirements in the IESB standards. Currently in the Australian inquiry as well, there's discussion about the fee disclosures. So in the third hearing of the PJC inquiry, there was discussion that we need to have more explicit categorization of the fees. So one of the proposals that is being put forward is that it should be disclosed based on audit fees, that is just for the external audit, then audit related services, other assurance services, and other services. So those are the four categories that are being discussed at the moment. Anyway, in Australia, the accounting standards stipulate that you need to disclose the audit fee and any other services that is provided by the external auditor. We have seen in some annual reports some entities going further and providing more granularity in respect of the other services. So what are your thoughts on the four categories that are being considered compared to this exposure draft?
I have to say today there is no disclosure of fees in the code. I think to a certain point we are kind of catching up with what's happening already in Australia. For us, and to go back on your first comment, the fact that we go beyond the IESB, it's absolutely true. We are in that proposal going beyond what is in the auditing standard. By putting on the table a requirement, a potential requirement to disclose fees. Right now, what we have in our proposal is I would say, requirement to disclose audit fees. And when we mean audit fees, we mean really in the context of a group audit, really what are the group audit fees. So not only the fees provided by one audit firm, but their entire network in relation to that group audit, or including also some component auditors, if there are some external component auditors. Because for us, the rationale or the intent is to be able to provide to the stakeholders, to the investors, a sufficient understanding and knowledge of audit fees for them to facilitate their assessment of the independence of the auditor. So our rationale, compared to the IESB is slightly different because we look at the issue from ethical independence and transparency viewpoint. And we know that our proposal goes beyond what is already there. And you mentioned that in Australia it is in the accounting standard. So the disclosure is done by the entities engaging auditors. However, our code applies to auditors, not to audited entities. So we are putting the expectation on the audit firms to manage the fact that there will be a public disclosure. If the client does the public disclosure, that's perfect. That will be in compliance with the expectation. But if it is not publicly disclosed by the client, there will be a need to find some other ways. And we know that could create some practical implementation issues. And it's a reason why we are putting this on the table, because we are really convinced that putting that knowledge in the public is extremely helpful and useful. We acknowledge the potential practicalities. And this is why we are really soliciting a number of comments in our exposure draft, because we would like to receive as much as suggestions, comments, to make sure that the final pronouncement will be on point and easy to be implemented, accepted, I would say, by our stakeholders, and really in working order.
Yeah, I can see the controversy that would be created by something that actually the client should disclose versus the auditor
Exactly.
then having to, if the client doesn't disclose, then the auditor
Yeah.
having to disclose could cause some controversy.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
But we are trying to put, I would say, an environment that will make it feasible and acceptable. And that's why we are soliciting almost the assistance and the comments also from all the community of our stakeholders.
Okay, thanks, Sylvie. So, Sylvie, what is the deadline for comment on these exposure drafts as well as IESBA's plan to finalize these proposals?
So the deadline for the comment is May 4, 2020, which is a much longer comment period than usual. It's beyond the usual 90 days because we really realize that it is, two pretty long exposure draft, a lot of questions, a lot of material, and we thought that we wanted to give enough time to respondents to prepare their response. So May 4. We intend to review all the comments by September. And if everything goes well, we expect to have a final pronouncement approved end of this year in December 2020. As to the effective date, it's a bit early to know when it will be effective. A minimum would be usually 1 year after the approval of a new pronouncement, but we know that those pronouncements will be pretty significant. So there is a good probability that it will go beyond just 1 year, but I can't give yet a date.
Yeah.
Yes.
And anything else you want to share with us, either in respect of these proposals or current IESBA projects?
On the comments, for us, I am really insisting to encourage all the stakeholders to provide their comments. It could be, when you look at the exposure draft, there are lengthy. Yes, there are a lot of questions. If I remember correctly, there are like 12 questions in the non-assurance service exposure draft and 15 in the fees exposure draft. Frankly, respondents, they don't have to really respond to every single question if they don't have the time. But if there are some questions that are very relevant for one stakeholder, or they have specific concern or suggestion, I would really encourage only to answer to those questions. Of course, we would love to have the full response, and we know that certain stakeholder would go through the full detail, but having the views on some specific questions are extremely helpful for us. Every input and feedback is very much welcome. So that's one point. The second point is also that I have to mention that we are issuing, perhaps it's already done today or by tomorrow or the end of this week, another exposure draft, very focused, very small, on the objectivity of the EQR, the engagement quality reviewer. And it's only 2 questions. That
Okay,
one.
that's good.
So it's a small one. So don't forget that one also if you are particularly for those interested in the in audits, and it is done in relation of IESB ISQM2 standard. So that one also is quite important to look at.
Okay, thanks, Sylvie. Also, to add to your comments about the 2 exposure drafts, as usual, APESB will be making a submission. So Australian stakeholders can make comments to the APESB, and we will take that into consideration in developing our proposed submission to the IESBA. I mean, as you know, APESB has been in the group of national standard setters at IESBA since its inception, and we closely follow the work of IESBA and respond to all the exposure drafts issued, because actually by having a global standard and Australia aligned as much as possible to the global standard, it facilitates global commerce and entities that operate across jurisdictions. So thank you, Sylvie, for your time today and providing insights into these two very important exposure drafts, and people can understand the background to its development and why it's important for the code going forward.
Well, thank you, Channa. It's great to have that opportunity to be with you today. I always enjoy very much, and frankly, the hospitality of the PSB is always fantastic. It's very good for us to have the capacity to really promote, explain, and clarify. And of course, will be and the entire board will be available if there are some question that we can answer to, if needed, to help you in your process to develop your response as well.
Yes, we are planning on having roundtables probably late March in Australia on these EDs, and I have invited the Australian representative on the IESBA, Ian McPhee, to be involved in those roundtables as well.
It will be absolutely perfect to have him.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.